The untold history of homosexuality in the ancient world. In one ancient city, two men flirting gets a laugh. In the next, it gets you in trouble. Same feeling, totally different rules. Come with me for a quick walk through those worlds. In Athens, it shows up in jokes, poems, and promises. In Rome, people care less about if and more about who's in charge. By the Nile, you catch quiet hints in tomb pictures. Between the rivers, temple stories mix worship with wanting. Far East, soft poems say what law books won't. Across the seas, some families make room for people who don't fit the simple man-woman box until strangers arrive and change the words. Some places laughed, some looked away, some punished. The feeling stayed. The meaning changed at every border. Tell me the exact time you're watching sunrise scroll or midnight dive. If this style of straight-to-the-point history works for you, tap like so the next chapter travels a little farther. You wake up in a world with no labels, no gay, no straight, not even a word for orientation. Love simply exists, like the sunrise or a cup of wine shared between friends. The ancients never sat around asking. So what do you identify as they didn't have to? Desire was just another natural appetite, something to be indulged, enjoyed, and occasionally gossiped about, but never classified. Imagine living in a society where you could love who you loved, and nobody invented a word to put you in a box. That's where your story begins. In the ancient world, identity wasn't about gender, it was about status. What mattered was who held power in a relationship, not who shared your bed. In Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and much of the Near East, the only taboo was a man of high standing playing the part of the woman. If you were the dominant partner, society barely blinked. But if you were the one being dominated, that might raise a few sculpted eyebrows. It wasn't the act itself that mattered. It was the role. The ancients saw sex the same way they saw politics. Someone's always on top. Picture a Roman senator lounging in his villa, sipping wine from a silver cup. His toga slipping just enough to show he's relaxed, but not careless. His guests joke about his new lover, a handsome youth from the Forum. Nobody cares that they're both men. The laughter only starts if the senator were rumored to take the passive role. It wasn't who you loved, it was how you did it. Even Julius Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul, faced teasing from his rivals who accused him of being the Queen of Bithynia. He shrugged it off, marched on, and became dictator. History, as usual, remembers the victory, not the pillow talk. In ancient Mesopotamia, things were even more fluid. Same-sex relationships weren't taboo, they were part of life's rhythm. Like trade along the Euphrates. Clay tablets from thousands of years ago depict men embracing each other, women tending temples together, and gods who could change gender at will. The goddess Inanna, better known as Ishtar, was famous for that very power to turn men into women and women into men. Her priests and priestesses embodied this divine fluidity. Some were what we'd now call transgender. Others were what modern people might label bisexual. But to them, those words didn't exist. They were simply divine servants, walking embodiments of transformation. The Mesopotamians even had prayers for same-sex couples, written in cuneiform on baked clay. In one ancient text, the Almanac of Incantations, a man who shared love with another man of equal rank was thought to invite prosperity and blessing. Only relationships across class lines caused concern, and that was true for heterosexual couples too. So, if you were a humble craftsman sleeping with a noble's son, you might draw whispers, not because you were both men, but because your social ladder didn't line up neatly. It's strange, isn't it? We often think of the ancient world as rigid and repressed, but in truth, it was the modern era that invented repression. Back then, people seem to understand something we've spent centuries unlearning, that desire isn't a sin. It's a fact. One ancient scholar put it simply, making love was a natural activity that should not be demeaned. They didn't see romance as moral or immoral, holy or profane. It was just human. Of course, not everyone in the ancient world lived inside a golden bubble of acceptance. Social rank still ruled everything. A free man could enjoy a male companion, but if he ever looked submissive emotionally or physically, he risked ridicule. It wasn't about purity or holiness. It was about image. Being masculine meant being in control, always. If that sounds familiar, it should modern men still face versions of the same pressure today. From boardrooms to locker rooms, dominance remains currency. The ancient world just admitted it more honestly. You might wonder, didn't anyone object on moral grounds? Hardly. Morality, at least the kind that polices the bedroom, didn't really exist yet. The ancients saw the cosmos as a vast system of exchange. You give, you receive, you love, you live. No one was writing commandments about what happened in the dark, as long as the city kept running and the temples stayed funded. Even in Egypt and Greece, the notion of sexual sin wouldn't take root until religion got involved. Before that, it was all just social choreography. And yet, when you trace human history forward, you find the moment when the tide turns the rise of a faith that begins to divide the world into sacred and sinful. But not yet, for now. You're standing in the warm dusk of an era when desire flowed freely through marble courtyards, temple corridors, and quiet gardens. Nobody cared what it was called because there was no word for it. It's almost poetic, isn't it? We, the moderns, with all our vocabulary and categories, are the ones still trying to describe what they already lived comfortably with love, unboxed. You follow the scent of baked clay and incense to the land historians call the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. It's a world that hums with prayers, markets, and the steady scratch of reeds carving words into tablets. Here, love and devotion don't need labels or laws. They belong to the gods, and the gods are wonderfully inconsistent. High above the ziggurats, the goddess Inanna watches. She's a divine paradox, lover and warrior, destroyer and protector. Her priests, known as the Gala, serve her by living outside the limits of gender. Some are born male but dress, speak, and move as women. Others claim both spirits inside one body. Inanna herself, according to the hymns, could change a man into a woman and a woman into a man with a wave of her hand. Imagine how revolutionary that must have felt in a society that still invented wheels out of clay. And yet, no one saw this as strange. To be neither man nor woman wasn't rebellion, it was reverence. These priests were considered holy, blessed by transformation. They led rituals, healed the sick, and recited poetry that would later echo through Babylon and Sumer. Thousands of years before modern gender debates, someone was already walking through a temple courtyard, robe swaying, living proof that identity could bend and still remain sacred. Inanna's followers weren't an isolated cult, either. The idea that love between men or between women could please the gods appeared in official writings. One ancient incantation book includes prayers for both opposite and same-sex couples, without a hint of scandal. It even promises that a man who shares intimacy with another of equal rank will gain good fortune. There's a rule tucked inside. Of course, don't reach too high or too low. Love across class lines might anger fate. Apparently, the universe was fine with who you loved, just not what tax bracket they came from. Imagine sitting in a Mesopotamian tavern, the air heavy with barley beer and smoke, as two men flirt quietly in the corner. Maybe they're both scribes who work for the temple. Nobody stops them. No one stares. Their secret isn't that they're together. It's that one of them borrowed a clay tablet and still hasn't returned it. It's almost funny how casual it all seems. In this world, same-sex affection appears in myths, art, and even creation stories. The gods themselves, Enki, Ishtar, Dumuzi, flirt, betray, reconcile, and sometimes cross boundaries that modern theologians would rather not discuss. The concept of divine gender fluidity was everywhere. In fact, Enki was said to have created a third gender specifically to serve Inanna, embodying both masculine and feminine traits. It's as if the ancients saw gender not as a wall, but as a bridge. Of course, not every tablet paints a picture of freedom. Some legal codes, like those from the later Assyrian period, start to show hints of regulation rules about who could sleep with whom, especially when property or lineage was at stake. But these were about inheritance and social order, not moral purity. Nobody claimed the gods were disgusted. That particular anxiety hadn't been invented yet. If you think of how early this was, 2,000 years before the pyramids, it's remarkable. Long before Western philosophy or organized religion, Mesopotamians accepted that intimacy could take many forms. They weren't theorizing it in universities. They were living it in temples, songs, and clay. A world of farmers, artisans, and kings somehow grasped what many modern societies still argue about, that identity isn't something you invent. It's something you recognize. You might even say, Mesopotamia gave the world the first recorded instance of gender diversity long before modern activists marched with flags. Before psychologists coined new terms. But back then, nobody needed a banner. You just served your goddess, offered your prayers, and went home to whoever made your heart beat faster. One of the most striking parts of these ancient records is their tone calm, matter of fact, no panic, no outrage, no divine wrath raining from the sky. Scholar William Nafi once noted how few ancient cultures in the Near East showed any moral concern about same-sex relations. To them, it was like singing, eating, or sleeping a part of being alive. If anything, the only sin was arrogance, forgetting your place in the hierarchy. Picture those bustling temple courtyards again, the oil lamps flickering, the hum of prayers in Sumerian. You can almost hear the whisper of a blessing floating through the incense. Love freely. Harm no one. And remember who you are. That was their moral code. Later civilizations would build on these myths, twist them, or erase them entirely. But for now, in the warm glow of Mesopotamia's evening fires, love has no shame. It's written into the clay itself, enduring, silent, and impossible to burn. You drift westward along the Nile, where sunlight gleams off sandstone temples and the air smells faintly of lotus and smoke. Egypt, the land of eternal return. Here, love and death share the same horizon, painted in colors that refuse to fade. The Egyptians didn't carve their sexuality into commandments. They painted it onto tomb walls. And if you look closely, you'll find that gender itself is more flexible here than the papyrus reeds swaying by the river. Pharaohs, priests, and commoners all lived under the same cosmic order. The balance of things. To disrupt that order was the only true sin. Everything else, merely human. So when it came to affection between men, the Egyptians took the same approach they did to floods or seasons. Observe it, record it, but don't moralize it. The story that often draws whispers is that of Horus and Set, two gods locked in a divine power struggle that included, depending on which version you read, an act that modern readers might label as sexual. Set, the god of chaos, attempts to dominate Horus not for pleasure, but to prove superiority. The other gods don't gasp because of the act itself. They gasp because Set's behavior is an insult to balance. It's not about sex, it's about power. Set is punished not for desire, but for arrogance. That's the Egyptian logic in a nutshell. A man could be bisexual, take lovers of any gender, and still be respected, as long as he never appeared weak. To play the woman's role was what raised eyebrows, not the relationship. Scholar Colin Spencer once put it this way: bisexuality in the male was accepted as natural and never drew adverse comment. But passive homosexuality made the Egyptians feel uneasy. In other words, everyone could dance, just make sure you lead. If you stroll through an ancient tomb, you'll see images that seem to hum with life: two men embracing, holding hands, or standing close in poses that mirror married couples. The most famous of these is the tomb of Neankhnum and Khnumhotep, royal manicurists to Pharaoh Niuser, around 2400 BCE. Their burial chamber shows them touching noses, a gesture reserved for married pairs. Their names are intertwined so tightly in inscriptions that even Egyptologists debate whether to call them brothers, lovers, or something in between. Perhaps, as the walls seem to whisper, it doesn't really matter. That's the quiet brilliance of Egypt's worldview. There was room for contradictions. A man could love another man, honor his wife, and still be considered whole. No priest was preaching doom from a pulpit. The gods were too busy managing the afterlife. And for a culture obsessed with eternity, they were refreshingly relaxed about the moments in between. Still, even here, power dictated pleasure. The higher your rank, the freer your heart. A pharaoh might indulge in anything he pleased and still walk like a god. A servant had to tread carefully. It wasn't moral hypocrisy, it was class preservation. The divine right to love came packaged with gold jewelry and political immunity. Can you imagine if modern gossip magazines wrote like Egyptian scribes instead of scandal headlines? The captions might read, "Pharaoh spotted with court scribe, again balance of mat maintained." Egyptians didn't hide their complexity. They stylized it into myth. Some ancient texts go even further, hinting at gender transformations and divine androgyny. The creator god Atum was said to have birthed the world alone, self-generated, containing both masculine and feminine forces. The goddess Mut was depicted wearing both male and female crowns. Even the mighty Ra could shift form at will. In a way, the divine itself modeled fluidity, long before philosophy tried to define it. Of course, as centuries passed, dynasties changed, and conservatism crept in. But for much of Egyptian history, the attitude was strikingly pragmatic. Sexuality was another facet of human nature, like hunger or laughter. If it didn't disrupt harmony, it didn't concern the gods. There's a strange comfort in that simplicity. No sermons, no translations lost in theological tug-of-war. Just a belief that what mattered most was balance. Maybe that's why, even now, standing before a wall of hieroglyphs, you can feel a kind of peace, an echo of a time when desire didn't need explaining, only understanding. The river keeps flowing, endless and forgiving. And somewhere in the wind that rushes through the ruins, you can almost hear it say, nothing human was ever foreign to them. Somewhere between marble columns and mountain sunsets, the world becomes obsessed with beauty. Greece, the land that birthed democracy, theater, and philosophy, also birthed one of history's most complex love languages. They didn't just accept same-sex love, they turned it into an ideal. To the Greeks, love wasn't merely an emotion, it was an education. Passion wasn't a distraction from wisdom, it was a path toward it. The sculpted male body wasn't just admired, it was celebrated as a reflection of divine form. Imagine a world where gymnasiums were literal temples to the human physique, and where the most respectable philosophers could talk for hours about beauty without blushing. The Greeks had a word for love that went beyond lust, philia, affection that refines the soul, and when paired with eros, the spark of desire, it became the foundation of their most famous relationship model, the Erastes and Eromenos. The older man, the Erastes, mentored and adored the youth, the Eromenos, shaping his mind, discipline, and morals. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But make no mistake, it was also political. These relationships weren't hidden. They were part of the social fabric. Statues, poems, and plays all echoed with the same message: to love a young man was to love potential itself. Even Plato, that marble-faced philosopher, joined the conversation. In his Symposium, he describes a ladder of love first, the attraction to physical beauty, then to moral beauty, and finally to the beauty of the soul. For him, the body was just a doorway to something divine. Later in life, though he changed his tone, in Laws, his final work, Plato seems to scold his younger self, warning that passionate attachments could lead to chaos. Maybe he just got old, or maybe he realized love, like philosophy, can't be fully tamed. The Spartans took a more practical approach. Their boys were trained in pairs, learning discipline and loyalty side by side. Love between warriors wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. A soldier who fought for his beloved fought harder. That logic produced the sacred band of Thebes, a legendary troupe of 150 couples who stood undefeated for decades. Their devotion as strong as their shields. When they finally fell at Chaeronea, even Alexander the Great wept over their bravery. It's hard not to see the irony. The very love modern societies once outlawed built some of the most disciplined armies in history. Greek society, of course, wasn't all poetry and enlightenment. Their tolerance had limits. Women were often sidelined, confined to the home, rarely afforded the same philosophical dignity as men. Female same-sex love existed. It's right there in the poetry of Sappho of Lesbos, but it never carried the same cultural prestige. Men wrote the rules, and the rules favored themselves. Still, there's something strangely modern in their contradictions. A culture that could glorify same-sex affection, yet police gender roles, sounds suspiciously familiar. Some philosophers today even argue that ancient Athens was the birthplace of both freedom and patriarchy, a paradox wrapped in marble. If you picture a Greek symposium, a candlelit dinner with reclining couches, wine flowing, musicians playing softly, you might see two men leaning close, exchanging ideas and glances in equal measure. Nobody there is whispering gossip about their orientation. They're too busy debating what justice means or which playwright captured the essence of tragedy. Love isn't the scandal. Love is the teacher. It's worth remembering, though, that Greek acceptance wasn't born of moral generosity. It came from a worldview that saw beauty and virtue as intertwined. To love someone beautiful was to honor the divine order. Desire was not about rebellion, it was about refinement, even in their myths. From Achilles and Patroclus to Apollo and Hyacinth. Passion was both sacred and tragic, celebrated and warned against. You might ask, did they really live by these ideals, or just talk about them? Probably both. Ancient Greece was good at theory. Practice was always messier. But even their contradictions gave the world something revolutionary. The notion that love could be intellectual, emotional, and physical all at once. Today, when modern societies still stumble over labels, it's oddly comforting to remember that nearly 500 years ago, philosophers were already trying to make sense of the same question: what does love make of us? Maybe that's the real lesson of Greece, not that they had it figured out, but that they were brave enough to ask. The marble roads widen, the statues grow grander, and suddenly you're in Rome, where everything from architecture to appetite exists on a scale too large for moderation. If Greece was about the philosophy of love, Rome was about the management of it. Here, affection wasn't a moral debate. It was a matter of etiquette, status, and image. And in a city where even the pigeons seemed ambitious, appearances were everything. Roman sexuality followed the same logic as Roman politics hierarchy first, pleasure second. The rule was simple: be the one in control. A respectable citizen could sleep with men, women, slaves, or courtesans, as long as he didn't appear submissive. Masculinity wasn't about who you loved. It was about who held power. That's why gossip about Julius Caesar's supposed role as the Queen of Bithynia carried sting. It wasn't moral outrage. It was mockery of a general's pride. Caesar himself famously brushed it off, conquered Gaul, and proved that history remembers victories, not rumors. The Romans inherited much of their worldview from the Greeks, but stripped away the sentimentality. The Erastes and Eromenos model became more transactional, less about education, more about access. A young man of lower status might gain patronage through a wealthy lover. And everyone understood the unspoken contract. It wasn't exactly romance, but it was Rome pragmatic, strategic, and always adorned with marble. That said, Rome had its fair share of genuine affection stories too. The most famous might be Emperor Hadrian and his beloved Antinous. The emperor met the young Greek during his travels and was instantly smitten. When Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile, Hadrian was inconsolable. He declared his lover a god, founded a city in his name, and commissioned statues that still stand across Europe. You can find Antinous's face carved in stone, youthful, serene, divine a love story immortalized not in poems, but in empire. It's easy to forget that such devotion once came from a man who ruled the world. Modern retellings often sanitize it. But the Romans didn't hide this part of their emperor's heart. To them, divinity and desire were intertwined. The gods loved freely. After all, why shouldn't men still? Not everyone had Hadrian's luxury. For common citizens, sexuality could become a political weapon. The poet Catullus, for example, teased rivals by accusing them of being soft, using words that blended humor with insult. Roman comedy loved to poke fun at men who played the submissive role, turning the bedroom into a stage where power was always up for grabs. To yield, even in passion, was to risk ridicule. You might notice something familiar here, the obsession with dominance, the fear of appearing weak, the confusion between strength and sensitivity. It's a tune that's been playing for millennia. Rome just performed it with better costumes. Women's stories, as usual, were quieter but not absent. Female same-sex relationships are rarely mentioned, though not condemned outright. In a society that rarely gave women political voice, their private lives went largely undocumented. One of the few sources comes from Juvenal, who writes satirically of noble women marrying each other in mock ceremonies. Whether he meant it as critique or curiosity is unclear, but even satire, in its own way, records what existed. Religion also played its part in shaping Roman views. The cult of Cybele and her consort Attis, imported from Asia Minor, introduced the Galli Jadsa, transgender priests who identified as women. They dressed in bright robes, wore heavy makeup, and served their goddess through ecstatic rituals. To the Roman elite, this was both fascinating and disturbing a reminder that the empire's reach included ideas it couldn't quite control. But rather than suppressing them entirely, Rome absorbed them like it did everything else. The empire was a sponge for contradiction. By the time Christianity began its slow spread through Roman streets, the old tolerance started to crack. Pagan practices, once just strange neighbors, became symbols of sin, love, which for centuries had been personal, was about to become theological. You can almost feel the temperature drop, the laughter in the bathhouses quieting, the mosaic floors cooling underfoot. Something in the air shifts, like the moment before a storm. For now, though, the empire still hums with life. Statues of naked gods still decorate public squares. Poets still write verses that blush across generations. And somewhere in the marble heart of Rome, two men still share a private moment, unaware that history is about to change the rules forever. You leave behind the marble and march eastward, past deserts, mountains, and monsoons, until the scent of sandalwood replaces olive oil. The world softens here, China, ancient and poetic, where silk scrolls whisper of emperors and lovers who never needed confession. In this land, same-sex love was not a revolution, it was refinement. Centuries before Western theologians argued over sin, Chinese scholars were writing verses about tenderness between men. Their stories weren't secret, they were part of the cultural record. In court documents, in plays, even in official histories. The affection between men of rank was treated as something graceful, ennobling. Scholar Louis Crompton once noted that Chinese same-sex tales show an unself-conscious acceptance of same-sex relations, in sharp contrast to the fear that haunted later Western faiths. The most famous of these tales comes from the Han Dynasty. around 7 BCE. Emperor Ai and his beloved Dong Xian are resting one afternoon. Dong has fallen asleep on the emperor's sleeve, and when duty calls, Ai, rather than wake him, takes a knife and cuts the fabric free. He walks into court in a torn robe, smiling. The story spread so far that the cut sleeve became a poetic symbol of male love. It's funny, isn't it, 2,000 years later? The same empire that built the Great Wall also built a legend out of compassion. But this wasn't just one emperor's whim. Records of same-sex affection date back centuries earlier, even before Confucius started rearranging society into hierarchies. Aristocrats and kings took male lovers from their courts, and poets wrote about it with tenderness, not shame. The Chinese term duangxiu, cut sleeve, became shorthand for this love, alongside others like nansi, male color. These weren't slurs, they were compliments. In these stories, love between men wasn't about power or dominance, it was about grace. The lover ennobled the beloved, lifting him spiritually as much as socially. The affection was idealized, delicate, full of restraint. Think less battlefield passion and more slow poetry by candlelight. Even the great Confucian texts don't forbid such love. They simply ask for harmony, moderation, and mutual respect, the same virtues applied to everything, from family to government. Female same-sex relationships, meanwhile, often slipped through the cracks of history, not because they were condemned, but because male historians didn't find them noteworthy. When Lady Murasaki would later write The Tale of Genji in Japan, she'd casually depict a bisexual hero without judgment, but in early China, women's intimacy was left unrecorded, hidden in embroidery and rumor. You might picture a courtier in Chang'an long robes, brushed hair, face powdered like porcelain, writing a secret poem for his male lover. He tucks it inside a jade box, not to hide it from shame, but to preserve it like perfume. Centuries later, someone might find it and think it a message between friends. But read closely, and the words burn soft with longing. This easy acceptance didn't mean there were no rules. Class still mattered. A noble could take a lover from among his attendants, but a commoner reaching above his station risked scandal. Yet even then, the scandal was about rank, not love. The empire didn't fear love, it feared disorder. There's a curious contrast here with what would later happen in the West. When Christianity spread through Rome, it introduced guilt to pleasure. But in China, Taoism and Buddhism saw desire as part of the natural order. Everything had yin and yang, balance and flow. Same-sex affection simply occupied another point in that cosmic harmony. Nobody called it unnatural. It was just another way the universe expressed itself. By the Tang Dynasty, poets like Li Bai and Du Fu would write with unrestrained sensitivity, sometimes for women, sometimes for men. The gender of the beloved rarely mattered as much as the ache of missing them. The tone wasn't scandal, but serenity. You could love anyone and still be virtuous, as long as your heart remained disciplined. If that sounds foreign to modern ears, maybe it shouldn't. We still romanticize forbidden love. Yet, in ancient China, love didn't need permission, it needed poetry. The empire valued restraint and loyalty over labels. So next time you see an old silk painting of two scholars under a willow tree, remember that's not just friendship. It might be the ghost of the cut sleeve, fluttering quietly through time, reminding us that tenderness once needed no justification. The mist thickens as you sail east across the sea, past waves that glitter like silver, until a chain of islands rises from the fog. Japan, a place where silence can say more than words, and where love, like a haiku, finds power in restraint. In medieval Japan, same-sex love wasn't whispered about in secret, it was taught as a virtue. Long before neon cities and modern politics, this archipelago followed the rhythm of monasteries, warriors, and poets. Love was woven into everything: duty, art, and even combat. The Japanese had a name for it, nanshoku, meaning male colors. It wasn't shameful, it was sophisticated. Monks, nobles, and samurai all saw affection between men as natural, even enlightening. The story begins with the monk Kukai, also known as Kobo Daishi, founder of Shingon Buddhism around 806 CE, revered as the great teacher. Kukai taught that enlightenment could be found through deep, disciplined love, not just of the divine, but of another soul. Though later legends exaggerated his teachings, his influence shaped centuries of thought. Under Buddhist philosophy, desire wasn't evil. It was energy to be understood, balanced, and transcended. And sometimes, that path began with affection between two men devoted to study and meditation together. In temples, monks shared not only prayers but emotional companionship. The older monk, or nenja, mentored the younger chigo, guiding him spiritually and intellectually. Their relationships were expected to be rooted in respect, but they were also human, filled with tenderness. It's easy for modern ears to misunderstand this dynamic. But in the context of its time, it wasn't exploitation. It was mentorship, devotion, and emotional intimacy fused into one. Meanwhile, outside the monasteries, Japan's samurai were shaping their own version of nanshoku. They called it wakashudo, the way of youth. A senior warrior could take a younger apprentice not only to train in swordsmanship, but to forge a bond that was as much emotional as martial. This love wasn't mocked, it was revered. Loyalty, courage, and affection were all expressions of the same virtue honor. A warrior who betrayed his beloved was seen as morally weaker than one who fell in battle. Think about that, in a culture that prized discipline above all else. Love between men was used to teach virtue. Imagine if modern ethics classes started that way. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, nanshoku had spread far beyond monasteries and barracks. It became part of art, literature, and even theater. Kabuki actors, especially the onagata. Male performers who played female roles became objects of admiration for both men and women. Woodblock prints, novels, and love poems captured the fluidity of gender and affection without apology. Some of these prints, beautifully delicate, show samurai exchanging glances or letters sealed with crimson ink, hinting at stories known but never shouted. One of the most famous examples comes from the playwright Ihara Saikaku, who wrote The Great Mirror of Male Love in 1687. In it, he describes dozens of stories about samurai, monks, and actors bound by love, loyalty, and tragedy. What's striking isn't the subject, it's the tone. Saikaku writes with warmth, humor, and empathy. To him, these weren't scandalous tales. They were human ones. Even Japan's women had their own quiet networks of affection, though rarely recorded by male historians. Letters and poems suggest bonds between women that carried the same poetic grace as their male counterparts. But once again, Society didn't assign labels. Passion was passion. The heart didn't need an explanation. When Christianity arrived in Japan through Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century, it brought a shock to this equilibrium. The Western idea that same-sex desire was sinful clashed with Japan's centuries-old belief in emotional purity. One Jesuit missionary, bewildered, wrote home complaining that the men here do not seem ashamed of loving each other. The Japanese, in turn, were equally confused. Ashamed of what? Exactly. The introduction of Western religion began a slow shift in perception. By the Meiji Restoration, late 19th century, as Japan rushed to modernize, it also imported European moral codes. Laws were rewritten. What had been natural for 1,000 years suddenly became unacceptable. Still, echoes of nanshoku linger everywhere in samurai loyalty, in the tenderness of haiku, even in the aesthetics of restraint that define Japanese art. You can feel it in a single brushstroke, a single unspoken glance between two men in a woodblock print. Love that doesn't need to shout to be seen. Modern Japan, for all its changes, still carries that ghost of elegance. The quiet truth beneath centuries of poetry affection in any form was once seen not as rebellion, but as discipline. And if you stand in a Zen garden at dusk, watching the raked gravel glow gold in the fading light, you might understand what they meant all along, love. When treated with grace, becomes its own kind of enlightenment. You turn south and west now, the winds changing from cool temple breezes to the heavy breath of jungles and savannas. Across the oceans and deserts lie worlds that rarely make it into history textbooks, kingdoms where gender and spirit were never confined to boxes. Here's the thing. Most people forget the idea of a third gender wasn't invented by modern activists. It was ancient, sacred, and global. In India, centuries before any Western lawmaker tried to define morality, the scriptures already spoke of the Kinnaras divine beings, neither male nor female. In the Manusmriti, a law code from around 1250 BCE, both same-sex and opposite-sex relationships were mentioned without moral panic. Later, the Kama Sutra, which pop culture often reduces to a bedroom manual, openly described third-gender individuals and their roles in pleasure, art, and spirituality. The people we now call hijras were not outcasts. They were once honored. They danced at weddings, blessed newborns, and served as intermediaries between mortals and gods. Theirs was a gift of transformation divine, not deviant. One ancient tale even describes Ardhanarishvara, the half-Shiva, half-Parvati form of the divine one body, split down the center, male and female united. Imagine how radical that vision was. Thousands of years ago, a god who looked at gender and said, "Why choose further east, in Southeast Asia?" Another identity took shape. In Thailand, the Kathi, often translated as ladyboys, though that term feels far too small, have existed for centuries, possibly millennia. Historical records from the 14th century mention them as healers, artists, and entertainers. They weren't mocked. They were recognized as part of nature's spectrum. Even today, though modern society treats them with a mix of fascination and prejudice, their lineage reaches back to temples older than many Western cathedrals. Travel across the ocean to the Americas, and you'll find something astonishingly familiar. Among many indigenous tribes lived those the modern world calls two-spirit people. They were men who lived as women, women who lived as men, or those who embodied both, but that description barely scratches the surface. To their communities, they weren't curiosities, they were bridges. Two-spirit people were healers, matchmakers, dream interpreters. They carried the wisdom of duality, the balance of sun and moon. A young boy on his vision quest might be visited by a spirit showing him who he truly was. If he returned dressed in women's clothing, the tribe didn't punish him. They held a ceremony to honor the revelation. Imagine that where later centuries would burn people for being different, these societies threw feasts, even in Africa. Long before colonial powers arrived with their imported Bibles and rule books, same-sex relationships and gender-variant roles were part of social reality. Among the ash time of what is now Ethiopia, men who identified as women served their communities in traditional female roles and often married men. They were recognized, not erased, in parts of Nigeria and Uganda. There were male wives men who married other men, often to continue family lines or manage households. Anthropologists still debate the details. But the evidence stands fluid. Gender wasn't rebellion, it was tradition. What ties all these stories together is reverence. In so many pre-Christian societies, difference was seen as divine connection. If you were born between worlds, you were closer to the gods who created both. You weren't pitied. You were consulted. The line between human and sacred was thinner for you. And then inevitably, the ships came. With them came priests, soldiers, and a new vocabulary of sin. The missionaries looked at two spirits and hijras and saw corruption where the locals saw grace. They called it unnatural, as if the Creator had made a mistake. But think about that irony for a moment. In lands where people lived peacefully for centuries, colonization brought moral chaos disguised as order. The old ways didn't vanish overnight. In India, hijras still sing blessings at doorsteps. In the Americas, tribes are reclaiming the two-spirit identity as an act of healing. The same voices once silenced by conversion and conquest now hum again, low and defiant. Maybe that's the real moral hidden in all these far-flung stories, that humanity, left to its own instincts, tends toward inclusion. It's only when outside systems arrive, systems obsessed with control, purity, and hierarchy, that love begins to need permission slips. So as you stand beneath the banyan trees of India or the red cliffs of Arizona, you can almost feel those ancient spirits moving through the air, reminding you that they never disappeared. They simply waited for the world to remember what it once knew, that divinity is not either or. It's always both. You feel the warmth fade as clouds gather overhead. The temples, the chants, the laughter, they dim beneath the tolling of a new sound. Church bells. The world is about to redraw its boundaries. What fire and sword could not destroy, a single doctrine nearly erased. With the rise of Christianity, the easy balance of the ancient world begins to crumble. Desire, once considered part of nature, becomes a battleground between heaven and hell. Where the Greeks saw beauty and the Chinese saw harmony, the early church saw temptation, a crack through which sin could seep. Love was no longer measured by affection or equality, but by compliance with divine law. It didn't happen overnight. At first, Christians lived among pagans who still worshiped their gods, bathed in shared baths, and loved whom they pleased. But slowly, the faith of a crucified carpenter began to reshape empires. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, and later emperors made it the state religion, theology replaced tolerance. What had been private became political. And here's the twist most people forget. The Bible itself never explicitly condemns same-sex relationships. Not once. The famous verse from Leviticus 18:22, often quoted as proof, simply warns, "Thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman." But the ancient Hebrews weren't discussing orientation. They were defining ritual purity, distinguishing their practices from neighboring pagan rites. It was a rule about identity as a people, not as individuals. Even church fathers like St. Ambrose later admitted that the real sin of Sodom wasn't lust, it was inhospitality. The men of the city attacked guests, violating sacred rules of welcome, not divine rules of romance. Still, interpretation is a powerful weapon. By the time the Apostle Paul wrote his letters to the early churches, he was warning believers to avoid the orgiastic festivals of pagan Rome. He used the Greek term arsenokoites, a word no one had ever heard before. Literally translated, it means male beds. Paul was probably referring to temple prostitution or exploitative rituals, not loving relationships. Yet in 1946, almost 900 years later, the word was translated for the first time as homosexual. And with that single act of linguistic surgery, centuries of misunderstanding were cemented. Imagine if ancient Rome's poets could see how their open talk of love had been rewritten as sin. It would have felt like watching color drain from the frescoes. In a few generations, the empire that once carved statues of lovers would melt them down into crosses. The church, in its early centuries, wasn't only defining faith, it was defining control. To build order, it needed clear lines between sacred and profane, saved and damned. Sexuality, so unpredictable, became the perfect target. Celibacy became holy. Marriage became duty, and everything else became forbidden. By the Middle Ages, those who loved differently had to hide behind monastery walls, coded poems, or silence. You can almost see it, a monk copying scripture by candlelight, his hand steady, his mind drifting toward memories he can't name. He looks up at the crucifix above his desk, wondering if love itself has been exiled from heaven. Outside, snow gathers on the cloister arches. Inside, guilt replaces prayer. In medieval Europe, laws began to mirror theology. The once fluid concept of intimacy hardened into categories: normal and abnormal, moral and sinful. The Inquisition would later hunt heretics and witches. But the culture it created also hunted feeling. The laughter of Roman bathhouses, the music of Greek symposiums, the songs of hydras and two-spirits, all replaced by whispers. Yet even in the darkest cathedrals, light flickered. The church itself couldn't fully suppress what it condemned. Some monasteries quietly tolerated companionships between brothers. In the 11th century, the Order of St. John included vows of affection between men that sound suspiciously like marriages. And among the clergy, letters survive gentle, longing. Full of coded affection, they speak of spiritual friendship, a phrase so polite it almost hides the truth. Almost. It's tempting to paint this period as pure repression, but it's more tragic than that. Christianity didn't destroy love, it mistranslated it. The divine language of compassion was replaced with fear. What was once sacred partnership became secret sin. The fire that once lit temples now burned books and sometimes people. As you move through these centuries, you start to sense what was lost, the world's memory of comfort with itself. Cultures that had long celebrated duality and balance were taught to choose sides, male or female, good or evil, saved or damned. Love no longer belonged to the heart. It belonged to doctrine. Still, history never erases everything. Even in medieval Europe's cold silence, faint echoes of the old song survived through art, through poetry, through courage that dared to remember. A painting of Saint Sebastian with his serene expression. A troubadour's ballad sung too softly. A gaze that lingered a second too long across a cathedral nave. They were reminders that repression can silence voices, but it cannot silence longing. And somewhere, buried beneath the sermons and ashes, the ancient idea still glows that love itself, in all its forms, might just be the holiest thing there is. The world brightens again. Slowly, the bells fade, replaced by protest chants, neon lights, and the thrum of city streets. Centuries of silence begin to crack. What the ancients accepted without question, modern civilization had to fight to remember. You stand in the shadow of Stonewall Inn, New York City, June 28th, 1969. It's after midnight. Police raid the bar, something that's happened countless times before, but this time, the patrons don't run. They fight back. Bottles fly. Sirens wail. And history tilts on its axis. The rebellion spreads for 6 nights. And the LGBTQ+ movement is born from the same spark the ancients once carried so effortlessly, the refusal to be ashamed of love. It's poetic, in a cruel sort of way. 2,000 years earlier, the streets of Athens, Babylon, Thebes, and Xi'an were filled with laughter and poems celebrating the same kind of love now outlawed and persecuted. Civilization, in all its progress, had somehow lost its memory. The 20th century wasn't a new dawn, it was a return. The march from Stonewall to modern rights wasn't easy. The church's shadow still lingered, whispering sin where there was only humanity. But cracks began to appear. Scholars revisited scripture, discovering the mistranslations that had caused so much pain. Words like arsenokoites were re-examined. Theologians acknowledged that the early church had confused moral panic with divine law. Even some priests began to preach compassion over condemnation. Slowly, the frost melted. You can almost see those ancient figures Inanna's priests, Egypt's manicurists, China's courtiers, Japan's monks standing quietly at the edges of that 1969 crowd, nodding in approval. The parade that followed, the first pride marches, were echoes of their forgotten processions, now revived under new flags. Humanity was relearning what it once knew instinctively, that love is not an invention. It's a constant. Modernity loves to call itself enlightened, yet it took millennia to rediscover truths carved in clay and painted on tomb walls. The Mesopotamians had already written prayers for same-sex couples. The Greeks had already sung about noble affection. The Romans had already built statues of divine lovers. Even the sacred texts, when read without prejudice, reveal a God far more complex and compassionate than his interpreters allowed. It's almost funny, isn't it? We call ancient civilizations primitive, Yet they handled human difference with a wisdom modern society still struggles to match. The Romans didn't invent pride parades, they didn't need them. Acceptance was built into daily life. What we now celebrate once required no defense. Still, history isn't just a circle, it's a spiral. Each return carries memory forward. After Stonewall came Harvey Milk, the AIDS crisis, marriage equality, and still more battles. The road remains uneven, but the silence has broken for good. Today, the languages of ancient love, those clay prayers, those painted couples have found new forms, rainbow flags, court rulings, film scripts, quiet conversations between parents and children. You might wonder if the ancients could see us now. Would they be shocked by how long it took to get here? Or would they simply smile, recognizing the pattern that humanity always stumbles, forgets, and rediscovers what it already knew? Somewhere in that long rediscovery lies a profound irony. The very societies that once condemned same-sex love often call for a return to traditional values. But those traditions, when traced far enough back, lead not to prohibition, but to reverence. The first traditional values were carved in Babylonian clay, sung by Greek poets, painted on Egyptian tombs, and whispered by monks under Japanese lanterns. And perhaps the deeper lesson isn't about sexuality at all. It's about memory. Civilizations rise, fall, and rebuild themselves on the bones of the forgotten. The ancients didn't have our words for identity, but they had something better ease. They lived without shame because they didn't see love as a category. They saw it as a condition of being alive. So when you hear the crowds cheering in a modern pride parade, when rainbow lights wash over cathedrals once used to condemn, you're not witnessing rebellion, you're witnessing restoration. The return of something humanity buried and finally dug up again. If you listen closely, beneath the drums and chants, you might catch the echo of something older, a whisper from the temples of Sumer, from the ziggurats of Ur, from the marble courts of Athens. Love is older than law and far more patient. And maybe that's how history should end tonight, not with judgment, but with remembrance. Because long before there were words for who we are, there was the simple truth the ancients never questioned: whoever you love, you belong to the human story. From hidden temples to royal chambers, ancient civilizations didn't just worship gods, they experimented with desire itself. Behind every myth and monument lies a world far stranger than morality ever allowed to admit. So if you thought history was all about wars and empires, brace yourself, because what comes next reveals the most shocking sexual practices in the ancient world. The first thing you notice isn't the heat, it's the rhythm. The air of ancient Mesopotamia feels alive, pulsing with drums and chanting, as if the desert itself remembers every secret ever whispered under its moon. You stand at the threshold of a temple to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, where the line between devotion and desire is non-existent. Here, bodies are instruments of prayer, and pleasure is the bridge between heaven and earth. Strange maybe, but in the world's first cities, it made perfect sense. In the city of Uruk, around 4,000 years ago, the people believed the goddess demanded more than offerings of grain or incense. She required participation rituals in her honor performed by priestesses and chosen men. It wasn't immorality, it was holy duty. Every act beneath her statue was a miniature reenactment of the divine union that, in their eyes, kept the rivers flowing and the crops growing. Imagine that where you might see scandal, they saw irrigation. This wasn't some isolated local oddity. Across Mesopotamia, from Babylon to Sumer, the so-called sacred marriage was a cornerstone of civilization. Kings themselves would symbolically marry the goddess each year, represented by her high priestess. The ritual sealed their legitimacy, after all. What better political slogan than endorsed by a deity in the temple's perfumed chambers? Chants rose, wine poured, and incense thickened until even the stars seemed to bend closer. You almost feel that warm dizziness yourself, the kind that comes from both devotion and too much date wine. If it feels theatrical, that's because it was. Religion back then wasn't about sitting quietly and believing. It was about doing. You didn't just pray for fertility, you performed it. The Mesopotamians believed the divine flowed through physical life, eating, drinking, building, loving. There was no wall between sacred and profane. To them, separating the two would be like trying to peel sunlight from warmth. Some later historians, uncomfortable with this notion, tried to sanitize it, claiming the so-called sacred prostitution might be metaphorical. But old cuneiform tablets paint a vivid picture, otherwise processions, songs, ritual beds, and blessings that fused spirituality with sensuality. And whether you call it myth or metaphor, the intent was clear connection. Connection to gods, to earth, and to one another. The priestesses of Inanna, known as Naditu or Kadishtu, were not the downtrodden figures moralists imagined centuries later. Many were educated, literate, and economically independent, quite radical for their time. They owned property, managed temple lands, and held a spiritual authority men respected, or at least pretended to. Through them, the goddess's favor touched the people. That favor, they believed, made the difference between prosperity and famine. Of course, not everyone approved. Ancient texts preserve voices of discomfort even then. Some writers muttered that the gods' excessive rites blurred moral lines. But morals, as you'll soon realize, are always products of their times. What seems shocking now was sacred then, and what's considered virtuous today might have made a Sumerian laugh. Wouldn't it be funny if, thousands of years from now, someone gasped at your culture's obsession with online dating rituals and called that sacrilege? There's also a quiet, haunting irony here. The cradle of civilization, the same place that gave us writing, law, and organized religion, also built its spirituality on acts the modern world blushes to name. And that's not a coincidence. Writing and ritual often evolve side by side. One records what the other enacts. On clay tablets, priests chronicled the ceremonies that bound their communities together. When they inscribed words for union, seed, or pleasure, they weren't recording sin, they were recording survival. You can almost picture it. Torches flicker against the ziggurat's walls, casting golden halos around carved reliefs of divine couples. A priest chants, his voice steady like a drumbeat. May the land be fertile. May the people be fruitful. A pair steps forward, perhaps strangers, perhaps chosen. In that instant, their bodies become vessels for the cosmos itself. Whatever your beliefs, you can't deny the poetry in that. And yet, like all things sacred, this practice wouldn't last forever. Empires rose and fell. gods changed names, and eventually, the same lands would hear prophets preaching purity over passion. But here, at the dawn of cities, holiness still had skin, and faith still smelled of oil, incense, and sweat. You linger for a moment longer, listening to the echo of chants that once shaped the moral compass of an entire civilization. The Nile never truly sleeps. It murmurs, sighs, and breathes life into Egypt's parched edges as if every grain of sand obeys its mood. You stand on a limestone balcony of the great temple of Karnak, watching torches dance against the river's reflection. Below, priests prepare for a ceremony that, if you squint past the incense smoke, looks more like a coronation than worship. Except tonight, it isn't about crowns, it's about creation. Here, the pharaoh isn't just ruler. He's a living god, a conduit of life itself. Every year, during the festival of Min, the ancient god of fertility, the monarch performs an act the scribes politely describe as renewing the world. The scene was depicted on temple walls in glorious hieroglyphs, the king, standing before his people, offering his essence to the land and the Nile. No euphemism needed. Egyptians believed that by reenacting the god's original creative act, the pharaoh kept the cycle of existence turning. Imagine a political leader today announcing he'd personally handle the nation's fertility crisis. It's hard to picture, isn't it? The logic, though, was deeply spiritual. To Egyptians, sexual energy was divine energy. Creation itself began when the god Atum, the self-created one, brought the universe into being through his own solitary act. It was not taboo, not shameful. It was the spark of life itself. The pharaoh, as Atum's earthly representative, carried that same cosmic responsibility. When he performed the ritual, the land was symbolically impregnated with abundance. Even the river joined in. Ancient hymns describe how the Nile's flooding coincided with the festival, as if the waters themselves responded to divine renewal. Farmers prayed for fertile soil, mothers for healthy children, and priests for cosmic order. It was a national spectacle where theology met hydrology faith that literally fed people. The Festival of Min wasn't the only place where Egypt blended sensual symbolism with religion. Temples of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood, were filled with music, perfume, and laughter. Her priestesses danced with sistrums, rattles meant to summon joy, and worshippers offered sweet beer, honey, and lotus petals. To outsiders, it might look like a party, but to Egyptians, joy was holy. Pleasure was not rebellion against the gods. It was gratitude for creation. Still, the grandeur of ritual couldn't escape human contradiction. Pharaohs, after all, were divine until they weren't. In private, royal life was tangled with politics and scandal. Take Cleopatra Zevon, for instance, the last pharaoh. Famous for her charisma and for mastering both seduction and strategy. Her allure wasn't just romantic, it was political theater. She embodied the divine femininity of Isis herself, using it to command loyalty and fear. The Greeks and later Romans misunderstood her power as mere temptation. But for Egypt, she was simply playing the oldest sacred role in the book. For the everyday Egyptian, beliefs about intimacy were practical and surprisingly humane. Marriage contracts dating back to 2000 BCE show couples negotiating property rights and even divorce terms with mutual respect. The concept of fidelity existed, but wasn't framed as sin. Rather, it was about social harmony. When conflicts arose, judges quoted the wisdom texts. A good wife is a household's foundation. Simple, pragmatic, and still recognizable today. You stroll past hieroglyphs showing lovers offering flowers, not conquest. There's something disarming about how comfortably they blended affection and duty. In the Book of the Dead, the heart, not the body, was weighed before Osiris to measure purity. Your actions mattered, but so did your intentions. It wasn't about repression, but balance. Contrast that with what would come later, centuries down the line. Christian theologians would reinterpret bodily pleasure as moral danger, linking it to temptation and downfall. The same act that once renewed the Nile would later be shrouded in guilt and secrecy. But for now, Egypt's gods smile easily. Life, death, and pleasure all flow together like the river beneath your feet. As night deepens, the chants from the temple grows softer. The pharaoh disappears behind a linen veil, and the crowd waits in silence, believing the fate of the harvest and perhaps the world hangs on what happens next. The stars above glimmer in approval, their reflections rippling on the Nile like a cosmic applause. You lean on the balcony rail, half skeptical, half awed, realizing that in this ancient kingdom, even the simplest acts were written in the language of eternity. The air in Athens smells faintly of olive oil and argument. You wander through the agora, where philosophers lounge on marble steps, talking about love as if it were geometry. The Greeks, unlike the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, didn't just do, they theorized. Every impulse had to be examined, categorized, and debated until it became a philosophy. And nowhere was that truer than when it came to desire. For the Greeks, love wasn't one thing, it was a whole vocabulary. Eros for passion, philia for friendship, agape for divine affection, even mania for the kind of obsession that made poets tear their tunics in the moonlight. Their myths themselves reflected this spectrum. Zeus chasing nymphs across the sky, Aphrodite rising from the foam, and mortals caught somewhere between ecstasy and punishment. You sit beneath a column and watch as a group of young men wrestle in the gymnasium, skin glistening under the Attic sun. To modern eyes, it might look like an art class gone too far. But in classical Greece, physical beauty was considered moral beauty. A well-shaped body symbolized a well-shaped soul. It was all very Platonic, literally. Since Plato himself argued that true love was about ascending from physical attraction to spiritual enlightenment. At least, that's what he said. In practice, things were messier. Greek society was built on hierarchies. Citizens, foreigners, slaves, and even love followed rank. Relationships between older men and adolescent boys, known as paiderastia, were part mentorship, part courtship, and part moral minefield. To the Greeks, it wasn't about identity, it was about education and dominance. The elder, the Erastes, was supposed to guide the youth, the Eromenos, toward wisdom and virtue. Whether that noble intent always held up is another matter. Still, before judging, it's worth remembering how differently the Greeks viewed boundaries. They didn't classify people by orientation. They classified by role. The one who desired was active, assertive, socially masculine. The one who was desired was passive, receptive, socially feminine. It was less about who you loved and more about how power flowed between you. A Roman senator, centuries later, would borrow this same logic to justify his own behavior. And Christian moralists would eventually condemn it as proof of civilization's decadence. But at this moment, under Athenian skies, it's simply how the world works. The great playwrights had plenty to say about it. Aristophanes, in his comedy The Birds, joked that love was a kind of madness that made even the gods behave like fools. Meanwhile, Socrates, with his infuriating calm, turned every conversation about beauty into a metaphysical trap. You say he's handsome, but what is beauty? You can almost imagine a poor student rolling his eyes, wishing Socrates would just admit he found someone attractive. Women, of course, occupied a different stage entirely. Respectable ladies of Athens lived quiet lives, rarely seen in public without veils. Yet in Sparta, just a few hundred miles away, women trained, owned property, and even teased men in open festivals. There's something refreshingly subversive about that contrast, proof that Greek culture was never a single thing. It was a conversation, a loud and contradictory one. And then there were the hetairae, educated courtesans who blurred every social line. Unlike ordinary women, they could attend symposia, trade wits with philosophers, and wield power through intellect as much as charm. Aspasia of Miletus, companion of Pericles, was rumored to have shaped some of his speeches. Imagine that the voice of Athens, echoing through history, possibly written with a woman's insight, whispered behind the curtain. It's hard not to marvel at how easily the Greeks embraced contradictions. They built temples to moderation, yet filled them with gods who acted like soap opera characters. They prized logic, but justified passion as divine madness. To them, the universe itself was an argument between restraint and release. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echoes of laughter from a long-ago symposium, wine cups clinking, flutes playing, men debating whether love comes from the gods or from hunger. Someone quotes a poem, even the wise are enslaved by desire. Another replies, then wisdom must be overrated. The night ripples with mischief and meaning, both inseparable in this world that worships beauty as much as it fears it. As dawn creeps over the Acropolis, marble turns pink and gold, and you begin to see what made Greek civilization so magnetic. It wasn't just philosophy, it was the audacity to treat pleasure as a path to truth. For them, the body wasn't an obstacle to wisdom, it was the first lesson. The streets of Rome smell like wine, sweat, and ambition. You push through the crowd in the Subura, the city's wild heart, where senators, soldiers, and slaves all brush shoulders. The empire hums like a giant machine powered by appetite. And if Greece turned desire into philosophy, Rome turned it into law. In ancient Rome, morality wasn't about who you loved, it was about who you outranked. To a Roman, intimacy was a political act, a statement of status. The free man was defined not by his restraint, but by his dominance. As long as he was the one in control, society didn't blink. It sounds brutal, but to the Romans, it was simply order. Everyone knew their place, even in the bedroom. You step into a bathhouse, steam curling up from the marble floor, echoes of laughter bouncing off the dome. Men gossip about senators and gladiators the way we talk about celebrities today. One boasts about a night with an actor, another complains about his wife's astrologer. The air is thick with oil and rumors. This isn't scandal, it's social networking. Roman style. Despite what later moralists claimed, the Romans weren't libertines in the modern sense. They had rules complicated, class-based, and endlessly contradictory. A married woman's chastity was a matter of family honor. An unmarried slave's wasn't. A man could indulge freely with prostitutes or courtesans, but an affair with another citizen's wife was a public offense. Augustus, the emperor who claimed to restore virtue, even passed laws to punish adultery while his own daughter, Julia, famously broke every rule he wrote. There's irony worth toasting to, yet beneath the hypocrisy, something fascinating emerges: Rome's obsession with control. Power governed everything, even love. Was a miniature empire someone ruled, someone obeyed. The Latin word virtus meant both virtue and manliness, tied to the ability to conquer. Losing control emotionally, politically, or physically was the one unforgivable sin. You wander past the frescoes of Pompeii, where scenes of banquets and mythic couplings cover the walls. When archaeologists first uncovered them in the 18th century, they were so scandalized they locked the artifacts in a secret room. But to Romans, these weren't obscene. They were reminders of life's cycle's abundance, fertility, laughter before death. The same tavern wall that advertised cheap wine might also depict Venus attending a lover's bath. Romans didn't compartmentalize the sacred and profane. They simply lived both at once. Roman literature captured that swagger perfectly. Ovid, the poet of love, wrote The Art of Love, a playful manual on seduction so witty it eventually got him exiled. He teased readers, "Make your love seem reluctant, it sharpens desire." Emperor Augustus, who pretended to guard morality, was not amused. He banished Ovid to the Black Sea, proving once again that in Rome, politics and passion were inseparable. And then there were the emperors, the ultimate myth and mirror of Roman excess. Nero threw wild banquets where guests reclined on cushions filled with rose petals. Caligula turned his palace into what gossipers called a living theater of desire, blurring performance and power until no one could tell which was which. These stories, exaggerated over centuries, became moral fables for later Christian writers who wanted to illustrate Rome's decay. But even if half were lies, they say something real about perception. When power grows too absolute, everything becomes spectacle. Still, Rome wasn't all indulgence and scandal. Many citizens lived quietly, bound by household rituals. Marriages were often political alliances, but affection existed. Tomb inscriptions speak of couples who loved deeply. "I never ceased to miss her. She made my home bright." It's oddly tender coming from a civilization famous for conquest. Even Stoic philosophers like Seneca advised moderation, not abstinence, but balance. Enjoy pleasures as a traveler enjoys a meadow without plucking all the flowers. Yet that Roman knack for rationalizing control would eventually meet its match. When Christianity spread through the empire, it brought a radical new idea that humility and restraint were holier than dominance. Suddenly, those same acts once carved in marble became sins whispered in confession. The empire that once glorified virility now worshipped virginity. You pass the ruins of the Temple of Venus in Rome, built by Emperor Hadrian, ironically, the same ruler who publicly mourned his male lover. Antinous, deifying him after his death. The Romans had always built monuments to passion, but Hadrian's grief carved it into eternity. You imagine him staring at the Nile, where Antinous drowned, wondering if even emperors could command the heart. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rings. The sound doesn't belong here yet. Not in this timeline, but you can almost hear history shifting, like marble cracking beneath new foundations. Soon, Rome's laughter will give way to prayer. But for now, in this steamy bathhouse, surrounded by gossip and gold, the empire still believes the world belongs to those bold enough to take it. The temple is quiet now. Gone are the drums of Mesopotamia and the laughter of Roman feasts. In their place, you hear only the soft scrape of sandals on stone and the rustle of linen robes. A flicker of oil lamps reveals a corridor lined with bronze doors. Behind one of them live the Vestal Virgins of Rome, women sworn to purity for 30 years in exchange for divine prestige. Their story is one of contradiction worshippers of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, keepers of the city's eternal flame, and yet surrounded by rumor, suspicion, and impossible expectations. You walk past their courtyard and notice the silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy, like a secret trying not to breathe. The Vestals were chosen as children, taken from noble families between the ages of 6 and 10. Once they donned the white veil, their old lives ended. No marriage, no children, no property, only service to the goddess. But unlike most women in Rome, they were free from male guardianship. They could own land, make wills, and ride in carriages attended by guards. They even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners if they met them by chance on the street. Power wrapped in chastity, a paradox that could only exist in Rome. The catch: break your vow, and the punishment was unthinkable. Since spilling Vestal blood was forbidden, a condemned priestess was buried alive. A small underground chamber was prepared with a couch, oil, bread, and a lamp. She was lowered in, the earth sealed above. Rome called it justice. Modern ears hear cruelty disguised as ceremony. The last known execution happened in 83 BCE, when Cornelia, chief Vestal, was accused of impurity. Historians say she climbed into the pit with dignity, protesting her innocence until the last grain of soil fell. But you can't help wondering how many were truly guilty, and how many simply became scapegoats in Rome's endless political games. The Vestals' power made them valuable, but dangerous. A whispered rumor could be a weapon. In one case, the infamous Lucius Catiline tried to marry a Vestal to legitimize his rebellion. Another time, an ambitious senator accused 3 priestesses of misconduct, only for public outrage to demand a retrial. Rome's obsession with purity had as much to do with politics as piety. The irony, of course, is that the flame they guarded symbolized fertility and domestic warmth, the very things they were forbidden to experience every day. They fed it with sacred oil, their faces expressionless, as though keeping the boundary between chaos and order alight depended on their restraint. And in a way, it did. The Romans believed that if the fire went out, disaster would strike the city. One careless night could doom an empire. You glance at the altar, its marble glowing softly in the lamplight. The symbolism feels almost biblical. Centuries later, Christian nuns would echo the Vestals' vows: celibacy, devotion, separation from the world. Monasteries would rise where pagan temples fell, each replacing one form of discipline with another. The theology changed. but the logic endured that a woman's holiness could be measured by how much she withheld from the flesh. It's hard not to feel sympathy for them. Imagine being told that your purity was the empire's insurance policy, that a single mistake could bring divine wrath upon millions. In a city addicted to gossip, how could anyone stay untouched by rumor? Some historians think the Vestal's strict celibacy was less about morality and more about control, a way for Rome's patriarchs to elevate and contain feminine power at once. Praise the goddess. Cage the woman. A familiar pattern, isn't it? One legend tells of a Vestal who proved her innocence by carrying water in a sieve from the Tiber to the temple without spilling a drop. Miracle or myth? It shows how desperate people were to believe that virtue could defy physics. The real miracle, perhaps, was endurance, centuries of women living inside those walls, maintaining a divine fire while the world outside changed emperors, wars, and gods. As you leave the courtyard, the night wind stirs the flame, and for a moment it flickers dangerously. A priestess moves quickly, shielding it with her hand, face calm but eyes wide. You see not purity or guilt, but exhaustion, the quiet weight of being both revered and imprisoned. You can almost hear her whispering to herself. If the gods demand perfection, they should try living like this. The flame steadies again, and Rome sleeps under its glow. Yet you sense a shift coming, far across the sea. New voices are rising, voices that will redefine virtue, sin, and the human body itself. The Vestals won't know it yet, but their story is nearly over. Soon, temples will close, crosses will rise, and purity will take on a meaning even stricter than theirs. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine follows you as you step into an Indian temple courtyard, where bells ring softly and a priest murmurs in Sanskrit. The air hums with devotion. But it's a different kind of holiness from Rome's rigid austerity. Here, faith is not about denial, it's about union. The ancient world called it kama, and in India, it was never separate from dharma or moksha, duty and liberation. Life, after all, was meant to be lived in balance. You watch as a group of dancers move through the courtyard, their feet tapping rhythms older than empires. Every motion, every curve of the hand tells a cosmic story, the marriage of Shiva and Parvati, the eternal dance of creation and destruction. In India, this union of opposites was not just mythology, it was metaphysics. The world was born from balance, male and female, sun and moon, fire and water. Even desire was divine, as long as it flowed in harmony with life's order. If Greece gave us the word philosophy, India gave us the art of embodied wisdom. The Kama Sutra, often reduced today to a mere catalog of positions, was originally a guide to living well mind, body, and spirit. Compiled by the sage Vatsyayana sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE. It taught that pleasure was part of a complete life, alongside duty, wealth, and spiritual pursuit. A man who neglects pleasure, it warned, neglects 1/4 of life. You might call that ancient self-care, minus the hashtags. But the Kama Sutra was just one branch of a much older tree. Hindu philosophy linked sensuality to cosmic truth through Tantra, a spiritual discipline where the body itself became a temple. Unlike ascetic traditions that sought to escape the physical, Tantra invited the divine into it. Breathing, touch, gaze, all were forms of prayer. To the tantric adept, The ultimate goal wasn't pleasure alone, but transcendence through connection. The human act became a mirror of the cosmic one. Imagine that for a moment, rather than seeing flesh as weakness, the ancients saw it as sacred text. Even the gods weren't exempt. In temple carvings at Khajuraho or Konark, divine figures entwine in impossible grace not as scandal, but as symbol. These temples were stone sermons, teaching that creation itself is the universe's first act of love. When British explorers rediscovered them in the 19th century, they blushed, covered the statues, and called them immoral. The irony was that their embarrassment said more about Victorian anxiety than ancient wisdom. In India's older stories, sensuality was never purely physical. The Sanskrit term kama means not only desire, but also affection, longing, and creative energy. The god Kamadeva, armed with a bow of sugarcane and arrows tipped with flowers, was said to awaken love wherever he aimed. When Shiva, the ascetic god of meditation, burned Kama to ashes for disturbing his penance, even that became a parable that desire destroyed leads only to sterility. Desire understood leads to enlightenment. There's something quietly radical in that thought. While later religions, especially under Greco-Roman and Christian influence, taught that holiness came from denial, Indian thought suggested it could come from mastery. The problem wasn't desire itself, it was attachment. Feel passion, the sages said, but don't let it own you. That's a lesson modern life still struggles to learn. Whether it's about ambition, love, or the endless scroll of online approval. Yet India's ancient openness didn't mean chaos. The laws of Manu, one of the foundational Hindu texts, set clear codes for behavior, respect for marriage, moderation in pleasure, responsibility in desire. The idea was not to repress, but to channel. A person who lost control was not sinful, just unbalanced. The universe was a rhythm, dance out of time, and everything stumbled. Buddhism, too, grew from this soil, but took a gentler approach, teaching that craving, not the body, was the root of suffering. The Buddha didn't condemn human intimacy. He simply urged detachment from its illusions. It's easy to see why his message spread so far. Who doesn't want peace from endless wanting? You move through the temple garden, where carved apsaras, celestial dancers, seem to shimmer in torchlight. Their faces wear that serene half-smile unique to Indian art, suggesting both joy and calm. You realize that to the people who built this place, the divine wasn't some distant abstraction, but a pulse inside everything that lives. A soft voice recites from the Rig Veda. When they joined in union, they created the world. It's a reminder that creation itself was once seen as sacred play, not shame. Somewhere between the hush of the chants and the scent of jasmine, you sense how different this worldview feels from Rome's discipline or Greece's analysis. Here, love isn't conquered or rationalized, it's revered. And yet, centuries later, when missionaries and colonial administrators arrived, they struggled to understand this comfort with the body. They brought with them a morality shaped by centuries of Christian doctrine. The idea that virtue meant control and salvation came through abstinence. The collision of these two worlds would change India's cultural self-image for generations. But for now, under the temple's flickering lamps, balance still reigns. You can almost hear the echo of ancient laughter whispering through the banyan trees. Why fear what the gods themselves celebrate? The moon rises over ancient China like a pale coin in a bowl of ink. And beneath it, the empire sleeps or pretends to. Inside the imperial palace, silk curtains whisper as attendants move quietly, carrying trays of warm tea and scrolls of yellow bamboo. You can hear the faint clink of jade ornaments, the sigh of a perfumed breeze, and the shuffle of silk slippers retreating down polished floors. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, a nightingale sings, unaware that this, too, is part of the emperor's ritual of immortality. In ancient China, pleasure wasn't just indulgence, it was medicine, philosophy, and sometimes a matter of life and death. The Chinese, with their love for harmony and balance, treated desire as part of nature's rhythm. Just as yin and yang guided the heavens, so too did they govern the human body. Yin was the soft, receptive, nourishing force, feminine in essence. Yang was active, creative, fiery masculine, health, longevity. Even political fortune depended on keeping the two in equilibrium. You could almost say that in China. Philosophy started in the bedroom. The Arts of the Bedchamber, a collection of medical and Taoist texts dating back more than 2 millennia, taught emperors and scholars alike that intimacy could strengthen vitality if practiced wisely. Too much indulgence drained energy, too much restraint made the spirit stagnant. The trick was rhythm like breathing, like music. The goal wasn't passion for its own sake, but the cultivation of qi, the life force flowing through all things. According to these teachings, the male's essence jing was precious and finite, like oil in a lamp. The female's yin, however, was regenerative, flowing like a river. The idea was that by carefully balancing exchange between the two, a man could absorb vitality from his partner, slowing aging and warding off death. Some emperors, quite literally, took that to heart and to excess. Take Emperor Wu of Han, known for his ambition and his longevity experiments. His court physicians prescribed elixirs made from mercury, gold, and strange herbs. But they also urged bedchamber cultivation, selective unions timed to the stars. Over time, legends exaggerated his nightly schedule, hundreds of concubines, each chosen for her astrological compatibility. A cosmic wellness routine, if you will, equal parts chemistry, superstition, and exhaustion. Other rulers were less restrained. The Yellow Emperor, mythic founder of Chinese civilization, was said to have written the first manual on these arts after consulting with the goddess Su Nu, who taught him how to govern the body as wisely as the empire. To rule the world, she told him, you must first rule yourself. Whether or not the lesson stuck is debatable, but the philosophy endures that mastery of desire was mastery of destiny. Outside the palace, ordinary people practiced simpler versions of these teachings. Taoist monks believed that through meditation, controlled breathing, and inner visualization, one could circulate energy internally, uniting yin and yang within the self. It wasn't about celibacy. It was about transformation, to turn instinct into enlightenment. But not everyone agreed. Confucian scholars, the moral bureaucrats of ancient China, viewed such indulgence with suspicion. To them, social order depended on restraint, family duty, and proper conduct. Pleasure for its own sake was dangerous. It distracted from virtue. You can almost imagine the debates the Taoists saying, "Flow with nature," and the Confucian replying, "Yes, but don't flow too far." And then came Buddhism, offering yet another perspective that desire, even disciplined desire, was the root of suffering. Monks shaved their heads, renounced attachments, and sought inner peace in solitude. For a while, these three worldviews, Taoist harmony, Confucian duty, Buddhist detachment, coexisted uneasily, like three musicians playing in different keys. But in practice, most people simply blended them. A farmer might light incense for Confucius, meditate like a monk, and still hang charms promising romance. China, as always, preferred balance over purity. Yet behind all this talk of philosophy, the human heart kept its own rhythm. Stories from the Tang and Song dynasties tell of scholars who fell for courtesans, poets who found enlightenment in silk pillows instead of scrolls. Li Bai, the wandering poet, wrote verses that blurred wine, moonlight, and longing into one shimmering dream. Love was still dangerous, especially for women, but within that danger lived beauty. You stroll through a moonlit courtyard, where a scholar practices breathing exercises beside a pond. He inhales through the nose, exhales slowly through parted lips, as if feeding invisible fire. Somewhere nearby, an emperor studies the stars, convinced that his next union will make him eternal. You can't help but smile. It's a scene both deeply human and profoundly cosmic. Centuries later, Christian missionaries arriving in China would call such teachings corrupt, mistaking the pursuit of balance for indulgence. They preached restraint, condemning what they saw as superstition. But to the Chinese, their philosophy had nothing to do with lust. It was about the same thing monks, priests, and poets have always sought the secret to staying alive a little longer and living a little wiser. The night grows still, the moon high and unblinking. Somewhere behind the walls, an old emperor drifts into sleep, dreaming of immortality. He does not know that in the morning another physician will arrive with a new elixir, another concubine with a new promise, another scroll claiming to decode the mystery of life. But for now, the balance holds yin, yang, breath, and silence. The drums come first deep, earthy, and relentless. You feel them in your chest before you even see the firelight. Out here, under the wide African night, the world feels raw and awake. Sparks rise into the air as dancers move in circles, their bodies painted in ochre and ash. The scent of burning herbs mixes with sweat and dust. And for a moment, you realize you're standing inside a living myth. In many parts of ancient Africa, sexuality was not something to hide. It was something to honor. It belonged to the same cycle as rain, harvest, and birth. The human body wasn't sinful. It was sacred architecture. Every gesture, every song, echoed a truth older than scripture. Life creates life. Among the Dogon people of Mali, for instance, creation itself began with a cosmic union between earth and sky. The universe, they said, was born from that sacred joining, and every generation reenacted it through fertility festivals. The villagers would drum and dance until dawn, celebrating the bond between human rhythm and divine breath. Farther south, in the grasslands of what's now Zimbabwe, the Shona tribes held ceremonies for Mwari, the high god of creation. Young couples were sometimes chosen to symbolize the renewal of the land. It wasn't spectacle, it was a prayer, a living metaphor for balance between nature and humanity. When the rains came afterward, the people said the gods had smiled across the continent. Similar rites appeared in countless forms. Some honored fertility spirits through dance. Others used masks and symbolic acts to invite the ancestors' blessings. What outsiders might misread as wild or primitive was, in truth, philosophy in motion. These communities understood something the modern world often forgets, that shame can't grow where life itself is celebrated. Yet Africa's spiritual landscape was never just about indulgence. Many traditions treated intimacy as powerful medicine, something that could heal or harm, depending on intention. The Yoruba of West Africa taught that physical connection carried ash, the vital force of existence. Misuse it, and you invite chaos. Wield it with reverence, and you align with divine order. You can see the echo of this belief even today in rituals of song and dance that mix the physical and spiritual seamlessly. Watch a Yoruba priestess whirl in trance as drums build to a thunder her movements, both human and divine. It's not eroticism. It's transcendence. To move is to pray. When Christianity and later Islam spread through the continent, this worldview collided with imported ideas of sin and modesty. Missionaries, encountering fertility carvings or dances, often destroyed them, labeling them pagan. But the people remembered. Beneath new prayers and hymns, old rhythms survived, hiding inside festivals, folk songs, and gestures. Even now, echoes of the past surface during harvest ceremonies or wedding celebrations, where ancestral customs blend with modern faith. A priest might bless a union in church on Sunday, and that night, the same couple might dance barefoot under the moon to honor their elders' spirits. Two worlds, one heartbeat. It's tempting to romanticize these traditions, but they were complex and diverse. Some tribes celebrated open sensuality. Others imposed strict taboos. Among the Zulu, for example, young people practiced forms of courtship designed to prevent pregnancy before marriage, balancing freedom with discipline. In Egypt's southern reaches, Nubian women were renowned for their intricate henna rituals, where patterns on the skin marked both beauty and blessing. Each culture defined propriety in its own rhythm. What tied them all together was the belief that the body is a vessel of life, not guilt. Even the most intimate acts carried social meaning, linking families, sealing alliances, marking transitions between youth and adulthood. In the villages of the Congo Basin, elder women sometimes instructed the younger ones in the ways of womanhood, not as shameful secrets, but as sacred wisdom. Knowledge was inheritance. You think of how different this is from the medieval sermons that would later define virtue as abstinence. In contrast, these communities saw restraint as context, not condemnation. There was time for work, time for worship, time for laughter, and time for love. Balance again. The oldest lesson of all. Somewhere behind the fire, a storyteller begins chanting, voice rising above the drumbeat. He's telling a tale of a trickster who stole the rain and was punished until he learned humility. The crowd roars with laughter, but the message runs deep. Creation and chaos live side by side. Respect one, and you honor both. You watch the dancers slow, the drummer's hands easing into silence. The flames sink low, and the stars stretch endlessly above. The scene feels timeless, part ceremony, part philosophy, part celebration. You realize that long before the word sin existed, people already understood consequence. They simply wrapped it in music and myth instead of shame. And as you leave the circle, the air still trembling from the drums, you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the ancients had it right all along. Life's rhythms are meant to be danced, not denied. The air turns sharp and cold. The warmth of African drums fades behind you, replaced by the creak of wooden longhouses and the distant howl of wind over fjords. You've arrived in the Norse world, a land where the sea is law, the axe is language, and pride means more than breath itself. Here, love isn't soft or sacred. It's a contest. Among the Vikings, intimacy wasn't about romance, it was about reputation. The sagas speak of passion, but rarely of tenderness. They tell of feasts, raids, and boasts shouted across smoky halls. The flickering firelight catches the glint of arm rings and ale horns. And in the corner, skalds recite verses that mix violence and desire into one seamless performance. To love in this world is to conquer, not to surrender. In Norse society, the greatest shame wasn't being cruel, it was being unmanly. The Old Norse word for that insult, ergi, carried a sting that could start blood feuds. To be accused of it meant weakness, submission, loss of honor. In a culture where every act was tied to status, even private life was a battlefield. A man could take lovers, male or female, but only if he remained the one in control. To be on the other side physically or socially invited ridicule. The body itself became a symbol of hierarchy. That harsh logic might sound familiar. The Romans had their version, too. But in the icy north, it was intensified by survival. When winters are long and food is scarce, strength becomes morality. Even affection wore armor. Marriages were alliances between families, not fairy tales. A woman might manage a farm, wield weapons, and rule a household, yet still be traded like a treaty. To be desired was not weakness, but to desire too openly, that was dangerous. And yet, beneath all this hardness, the Norse still told stories of gods who felt deeply, sometimes foolishly. The trickster Loki, for example, shapeshifted into both male and female forms, birthing an 8-legged horse. Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, wept tears of gold for her missing husband. Even Odin, the All-Father, practiced cider, a kind of magic associated with women, earning him whispers of ergi. Paradox again, the gods broke the very rules mortals feared to test. You sit in a mead hall as men trade jests sharper than their blades. One brags about his conquests, another taunts him for cowardice in battle. Somewhere between laughter and violence lies the truth. Norse masculinity was performance. Every boast, every insult, every gesture was a declaration of worth. Even their poetry. Those cryptic kennings that compared kisses to battles and hearts to fortresses was built on the idea that emotion had to be conquered before it could be confessed. Women in this world wielded subtler power. Sagas speak of shield maidens and vulvas, warrior women, and seeresses who commanded fear and awe. A wife could divorce her husband by declaring it publicly before witnesses, reclaiming her dowry and dignity. But societal respect came with a cost. The same tongue that praised a woman's wisdom could destroy her with rumors of looseness or witchcraft. The line between reverence and accusation was as thin as a sword's edge. And then there were the blood feuds, sparked by slander. Call a man Arger, accuse him of cowardice or passivity, and you might find yourself challenged to a duel at sunrise. Words could kill. Literally, the sagas are filled with these fatal quarrels, proof that in a world obsessed with honor, even language had sharp edges. Still, love found its way through the cracks. In the poetic Edda, lovers meet under the moon, promising faith despite fate. One verse reads, "Better to have loved and lost than never to have fought at all." For a Viking, affection was another form of courage, something to risk, not to hide. You can almost see the scene: a longship rocking on gray waves, a warrior staring back at the shore, where a figure stands in furs, watching until the sails disappear. There's no kiss, no goodbye, just the silent understanding that both might die before they meet again. Love here doesn't need words. It's carved into bone, sung into wind. Centuries later, Christian missionaries would arrive, bringing new moral codes that prized humility over heroism. They condemned the old songs, called the feasts debauchery, the rites heathen. And yet, even after conversion, echoes of the old code survived. The Icelandic sagas, written down by Christian monks, still hum with pagan defiance. The Norse never truly forgot that strength and passion were two sides of the same fire. You walk out of the hall into the biting wind. Snowflakes sting your face as the northern lights shimmer overhead, green and ghostly. For a moment, the sky looks alive, a reminder that even here, in a land of iron and ice, the human heart still burned. The Vikings may have worshipped battle, but they also knew something deeper, that courage in love and courage in war are often the same thing. Both demand surrender, both risk everything. The firelight fades, and the world grows quiet. You've traveled from the temples of Mesopotamia to the fjords of the north, from the warmth of Egypt to the snows of Scandinavia. And yet, the strangest transformation of all is still ahead, the one that took place not in a city or a ritual, but inside the human conscience. When Christianity rose, the ancient world didn't just change its gods, it changed its view of the human body itself. In the centuries after Rome's fall, the old temples crumbled, the chants of Inanna, the songs of Hathor, the hymns to Dionysus, all silenced under the echo of new prayers, stone by stone. Churches replaced shrines, saints replaced deities, and flesh, once seen as divine, became something suspect. Early Christian thinkers like St. Augustine struggled to reconcile faith with desire. A former student of philosophy and pleasure, Augustine wrote that his body commanded him against his will, and he called it sin. To him, humanity's greatest flaw was not violence or greed, it was passion without control. The same yearning that the ancients had celebrated as life-giving became, in his view, a scar left by the fall. It was a seismic shift. Where the Egyptians saw creation in the act, the Christians saw temptation. Where India mapped ecstasy as enlightenment, the Church mapped it as danger. Pleasure now carried risk not to the body, but to the soul. Salvation required discipline. Monks fled into deserts, fasting and flagellating to conquer the flesh. Celibacy became a badge of holiness. and the body, once an instrument of prayer, became a battlefield between purity and sin. That isn't to say Christianity invented repression. Rather, it codified it. Rome had already equated morality with control. The Church simply gave that control eternal consequence. Instead of being unmanly, now one risked being unholy. Heaven replaced honor as the prize. But the rules stayed eerily similar. The irony. Many early Christian communities were born in the same cities where ancient gods of love once reigned. In Corinth, the Apostle Paul preached chastity under the shadow of Aphrodite's old temple. In Ephesus, converts burned scrolls of magic and charm, while the marble statue of Artemis still watched from her pedestal. The transition wasn't clean, it was cultural archaeology, each faith layered over another. Still, the new message spread fast. By the 4th century, Emperor Constantine had legalized Christianity, and within a generation, it became the empire's dominant creed. The same state that once worshipped Venus now funded basilicas. Pagan festivals were renamed or repurposed. Even old fertility rituals like spring celebrations of rebirth were baptized into Easter. The gods didn't vanish. They simply changed names. You stand inside one of those early basilicas. The air smells of incense and candle wax. Sunlight filters through colored glass, painting the floor in shards of blue and gold. At the altar, a priest lifts a chalice and whispers of redemption through sacrifice. Around him, stone angels gaze down with folded wings, eternal, motionless, pure. It's beautiful, but also haunting. You can't help thinking of the temples you've seen, the laughter, the dance, the fragrant smoke. The ancient world treated life as divine theater. This new world treats it as test and trial. Both seek transcendence, but by opposite routes, one through acceptance, the other through abstinence. And yet, not all was lost. In monasteries and hidden libraries, the wisdom of the old world quietly survived. Greek philosophy, Indian metaphysics, even fragments of Egyptian mysticism filtered through medieval scholars. By the time of the Renaissance, whispers of the body's beauty began to return, painted in marble, sung in poetry, and finally, justified again as art. Michelangelo's David stood naked in a Christian square, and no one could quite decide whether he was sinner or saint. But the shadow of that transformation still lingers. Even today, much of Western thought carries the echo of Augustine's struggle, the uneasy dance between guilt and wonder, instinct and discipline. We scroll through digital temptations, invent rules for modern virtue, and argue endlessly about morality, unaware that we're reenacting a conflict 2,000 years old. So you pause for a moment, imagining all those ancient voices, still murmuring beneath the ground, the Mesopotamian priestess, the Egyptian pharaoh, the Greek philosopher, the Roman matron, the Indian dancer, the Chinese alchemist, the African storyteller, the Norse skald. Each had their own way of understanding the same mystery, that to be human is to wrestle with desire, to seek meaning in the body's language. And maybe that's the final irony, that what shocked us most about the ancient world wasn't their rituals, but their honesty. They looked at creation, saw themselves in it, and called it sacred. We looked at the same thing, felt the same awe, and called it temptation. Outside, a church bell tolls. The sound rolls across the ruins of old temples, through olive groves and broken columns, fading into the dusk. You take one last breath, feeling both the weight of history and its strange comfort. The world has changed its gods, but the questions remain the same. So now, as the echoes of ancient drums fade and the marble halls fall silent, you realize history was never just about empires or gods. It was about the endless search for meaning within our own hearts. The ancients danced, prayed, and dreamed through the same desires we still carry, only with less shame and more wonder. Let that thought drift with you now. The world turns. The stars keep their rhythm. And somewhere in the quiet, you are part of that same eternal story. Close your eyes and let time itself fall asleep beside you.